Mr. Desmond Hoyt. Mr. Hoyt, once again, welcome to Carib Nation. This is my third interview with you in 2 years, so you're a regular. I'm going to ask you some tough questions today because the situation in Guyana demands tough questions and some serious answers. Let me ask you straight up. Are you embarrassed that 3 times over the last 9 months, CARICOM officials have had to go into Guyana to help to bring some solution to problems you have there?
No, I wouldn't say that I'm embarrassed. I would have thought that the CARICOM leaders saw an opportunity to demonstrate the interconnection between Guyana and the rest of CARICOM. That, we're talking about being a region. We're talking about people having common interests, moving towards a single market, a single economy, and in a sense, a single identity, And I do not find it offensive in any way that they should try to help. And I would be the last person to say to CARICOM leaders, don't come into Guyana and try to assist in a very difficult situation.
But don't you think it's a reflection that the Guyanese people, the Guyanese political leaders, cannot solve their own problems?
Well, it's not that we can't solve it, but I think that the CARICOM leaders felt that they could play a role. You can solve problems in many ways. I mean, the problems that we had and still have, we're heading towards a serious resolution through conflict. And the question is whether that was the best way. The CARICOM leaders proposed another way of dealing with the problems and the conflicts.
Let me hold on to that word you use, conflict, because you're quite right in describing the situation as one of conflict. That conflict manifests itself not just politically, but racially.
Yes.
And I think that's very dangerous.
Yes.
We have a situation in Guyana where the country is racially polarized.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that we can continue to deal with politics the same way as we've been doing all the time, and solve the problem that way?
No, absolutely not. First of all, I think that we have to acknowledge that we have a multiplicity of problems, of which race is a prominent one. Many people still deny that you have a racial problem, and therein lies a problem. Another problem, if we acknowledge that there's a racial problem, then we have to face this problem frontally and in a very intelligent way, try to see how we could so structure our constitution and our internal social and other arrangements so as to minimize, if not completely eliminate, this racial problem. And that is what we're grappling with right now.
I am not one of those persons who like to harp on 28 years of
Mm-hmm.
PNC rule, but I've got to ask you this
Mm-hmm.
question
Mm-hmm.
pointedly.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Guyana and I saw the demonstrations immediately after the election.
Yeah.
And it was clear to me that the majority of your supporters were African Guyanese,
Yes.
were demonstrating against more than just election rigging. They were demonstrating against their condition, their economic and social condition. And I want to ask you, how do you feel that your government, which was supported by the majority of black people
Mm-hmm.
for 28 years,
Mm-hmm.
now you're out of
Mm-hmm.
office, and that they are in the position they're in economically and socially?
Well, let's get back and look at this thing in perspective. They were demonstrating not only against what they perceived to be massive manipulation of the election results, but against bad governance, victimization, discrimination, joblessness, which is very high, particularly among young people. So it's a very complex situation there. Now, bear in mind that in 1985, when I took office, the economy was in a very bad way, and the whole objective had to be to restore the economy from one of stagnation to one of growth. And the development of opportunities for employment, for investment, and things like that. And we started to do that. In the 5 years, we did a remarkable turnaround, which put the Guyana economy on a firm basis for what I would call a rapid takeoff. We got the growth rate going again at what, 6, 7%. We got investments coming in from United States, from Canada, from United Kingdom, continental Europe, and to me, most satisfying of all, from the Caribbean. Prior to that, no Caribbean businessman was going to touch us with a 10-foot pole. And so we had the policies and we had the programs and we had created a climate which would have created the kind of economic situation which would have given the Guyanese people an opportunity to really move forward and develop themselves. Unfortunately, those policies were not carried out by the PPP when they came in. And it's a fact that between 92 when they got into office and now, there has not been another major significant investment in the country. And that is why today we are in economic crisis. And we've gone right back where the first half of this year we had negative growth. In other words, you've gone full circle.
Let me press you on this
Yes.
question. You've said that the People's National Congress, your party, is not a black people party. It's an all-inclusive party.
That's what we...
However, the majority of your support, the bulk of your support,
absolutely the same as the majority of the PPP supporters are Indians.
are Indians. But it seems to me that African people in Guyana have some special problems.
Yes.
That may not be necessarily the same with the Indian Guyanese. What I want to find out from you is whether your party intends at any point, whether in opposition or if you get back in government, to tackle the problem, this particular problems of African Guyanese in that country.
Well, let me put it this way, that no government, if it wants to succeed, can present itself as being a government or part of a country. And I think that's the mistake that the PPP has been making.
Okay.
I think the first principle of government is that when a political party is elected to office, it becomes the government of all the people. And it has to be seen to be non-partisan, to be even-handed, to be just. And that is what a People's National Congress government will try to do. Now, that does not mean that in terms of development, one does not look at or cannot look at particular areas, whether they be geographical, there are some parts of the country that are depressed, whether it be ethnic, because bear in mind that you have large numbers of poor Indians. People talk sometimes if every Indian is rich, every Indian has a big bite. It's not true. They suffer from the same bad housing, bad roads, drainage, and so on, as black people do. Black people being the urban people, it is more prominent, it's more easily recognized, and so on. So what I'm saying is that we have to look at all sections of our society, and we have to devise policies that will discriminate positively in favor of depressed geographical sections, depressed ethnic sections, and so on, without appearing to be unjust.
One cannot,
and in fact, without being unjust.
Without being unjust.
Yes.
One cannot fault Desmond Hoyt for attempting to reach out to all sections. In fact, you've been called Desmond Facade. But I still have to press you on the question of African Guyanese, because African Guyanese are in the public sector, and the IMF and World Bank conditionalities affect those people in the public sector.
People on fixed wages.
On fixed wages more than the others. And so what I want to hear from you is, quite apart from your grand national plan, your particular plan to arrest the deteriorating situation among African Guyanese.
Well, one of the things we had put forward as an election issue as part of our platform was the creation of a the spirit of entrepreneurship among people. The thing with, I mean, let's face it, whether for whatever reasons, cultural or what, you find that our Indian citizens tend to be more entrepreneurial than the citizens of African descent. And I think that we have to create the mechanisms for helping young people, which would include a large number of young Black people, uh, to acquire an impulse to be entrepreneurial. I mean, when they leave school, not to say, well, who can employ me? Give me a job, sir,
Mhm.
but they want to go out to create businesses for themselves.
How are you going
Now,
about doing?
oh, fine. First of all, you have to start in the schools, and you have to start to set up special uh, mechanisms for giving them the formal training. You have to um, create financial institutions which would provide them with uh, the financial resources they may need. You have to have an outreach program which will help them with the management. You don't tell them start a business and you run away, you leave them.
Mhm.
You have to you have to hold their hands for some time through some kind of outreach program. You have to help them with things like marketing, right? And generally consciously create a class of young entrepreneurs, who will then have an opportunity to grow, make wealth, because the making of wealth is not a bad thing or a dirty thing in the dictionary of the People's National Congress. You want to get people to aspire to you know uh, build an economic base, which will make them comfortable in their families and comfortable and so on. So it is a whole program that we have to do to revolutionize people's thinking.
Mhm.
And that is one of the things we said we would do, and one of the things we still hope to do. On the other hand, you have organizations like ACTA, right, which is the African Cultural Development Association. And I talked to some of the people there, and I urged them to do the same kind of thing, you know. So it's something not only for the government, but for the association of Black people and other people who are interested in the development of our country. Because it's not good enough to build a road and to build a school and a hospital and so on if you're not building people, if you're not building people the skills and the drive to
Mhm.
really take charge of the country and the economy.
Mr. Hoyt, you led a massive movement after the elections.
Yeah.
People on the street,
Mm.
they were demonstrating, they were venting their anger, not only against the PPP, but
Mm.
against politics
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Guyana in
yeah,
general.
yeah.
And then at a certain point, you pull the marchers off the street, and there was some dissatisfaction. Look back at that and tell me whether today you think that you made the right decision.
Yeah, I think so. After a time, to many people, marching became an end in itself. Every day we'll say, we're marching tomorrow, we're marching tomorrow. But marching for what? What was the objective? And as the marches got bigger and bigger, you found that some unruly elements inserted themselves into the demonstrators and did some mischief in terms of some looting here and there, some destruction of property. Now, it was no part of our agenda to destroy the country. We don't want to destroy Guyana. We were making a point. We wanted to tell the PPP that we were completely dissatisfied and that we wanted something in place to redress these grievances that we had. Now, you'll recall that somewhere along the line, the CARICOM people came in and proposed a formula, which on paper was a good formula, except that the PPP showed no good faith that was the Herdmanston Accord,
Mhm.
in implementing the provisions of the Herdmanston Accord. Because one of the things, I mean, looking down the road, I mean, there were short-term objectives, but there were longer-term objectives, like the Constitution. We need constitutional reform. We need a kind of constitution which will prevent any one group from dominating the other group or putting one group in a position to victimize and discriminate. You need to just strengthen those elements of the
And
Constitution.
on that note,
Yeah.
we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll continue this conversation with Mr. Hoyt on constitutional reform and Mr. Hoyt's plan for dealing with the whole question of racial division in the country, both from an economic and political standpoint. So don't go anywhere. Carib Nation, we'll be right back.
Oh, yes. Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to today's of Politics 101. Mr. Hugh Desmond Hoyt, who I had the privilege of interviewing about four times. And I'm writing a piece, and I, of course, wanted to do some research. And so I went back and I found this one, and I thought I'll share some of it with you tonight. Yes, it was a long time ago. I had hair, I had beard. I just, it was, the interview was done in 1998. So let's do the count. 1998, that's 26 years ago. 26 years ago. It was shortly after the 1997 election, and we know Mr. Hoyt led massive demonstrations in Georgetown, slow fire, more fire, and so forth. And so, yes, it was done in 1998. I did that interview in Washington, D.C. I was then, and still in some ways, I'm part of a program called Carib Nation, which is the oldest Caribbean television program in the United States. We started in 1995, and it's still going there. Every now and again, I do a program here, and in fact, they asked me to do something on Haiti for them this week. And so I still have a relationship with that program. But yes, that interview with Mr. Hoyt, I wanted to share with us tonight for some of you for obvious reasons. Sometimes we live in the present and we are consumed with the present, and we think that what we are dealing with in the present is new. We never had to deal with them before, and so we sometimes don't have a reference point for what we are doing. And I decided to play that interview. I noticed some of you are saying Mr. Hoyt is hitting some of the points. In fact, all of what we are dealing with today, with the PPP, Mr. Hoyt dealt with in that interview. And of course, they were dealing with it back then. Good evening to you, and welcome to Politics 101. Welcome to Politics 101. Please share the link. Please share the link and let everyone know that we're on, whether you're in Guyana or outside of Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. Good night. Good night to those of you who are in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in France. Welcome. I noticed St. Kitts Nevis is in the house. Welcome to all of you. Melanie Damishana is in the house. Welcome, Melanie. It's a special place. As a schoolboy, I worked at Melanie. We used to, as school children, when they were building up that scheme, we used to go and do what they call self-help in those days. And sometimes I'm so disappointed when I see what the PPP has done to Melanie Damishana. All the things that Burnham and the PNC did, they destroy. It's sad. And it points to a negative aspect of our politics, a very negative aspect of our politics, in the sense that we feel that if the other party did something, we have to tear it down, and we don't see the positives in the other side. No sense of continuity. And no country develops in that way. No country develops in that way. There were many of us who opposed the PNC government on matters of principle, on matters of governance and so forth. But we also recognize that there were some positive things that the PNC did. And we have to admit these things. Some people have been beating me over my head because I said on a program the other morning that Dr. Jagger never used the term Apanjat. And some people say, oh, David Hines defending Jagan. I don't have to defend Jagan. Jagan get enough people to defend him. I'm just merely speaking the truth. Jagan did not use the term Apanjat. However, Jagan benefited from Apanjat. And I did say that. But, you know, sometimes people conveniently hear what they want to hear. Jagan benefited from Apanjat politics. Jagan used Apanjat politics as a form of mobilization. I was just saying he never used the term. The term in modern times, from my research, was used by a man named Daniel Debedin at the 1953 election. And he used it against Jagan because Jagan and Burnham and them were in the PPP. And there were Indians outside of the PPP in those days who were saying to East Indians, don't vote for Jagan and them because they mix up with the black people. Vote for your own. Hence, Apanjat. Jagan didn't use the term, but Jagan subsequently benefited from Apanjat politics, which is vote for your own. And so I was making the point that one doesn't have to lie in order to make your point. Jagan did not use the term, but he used the concept to mobilize his people, and he benefited from it. And so you don't have to walk around the place and say, Jagan, they used the term Apanjat to make your point. No. He went further than using the term. He employed the concept. And so sometimes our people got to be very careful. You see, I am not interested in inspiring hatred in our supporters in African Guyanese. We are the victims, African Guyanese, black people, we are the victims of race hate. And I do not want to inculcate and encourage us to reciprocate with race hate. The correction for race hate is not race hate. We have to fight against race hate. And so it's unfortunate that some of my good brothers and so on felt I was defending Jagan when I said that he didn't use the term and didn't take the time to recognize that I was saying he went further than using the term. He employed the concept as a form of political mobilization. He benefited from, which is worse than using the term. Yet, because I said he didn't use the term, Dr. Hines defending Jagan. Come on, guys, we got to be very careful. We got to be good listeners sometimes, and we have to put things in context. Jagan didn't use the term Apanjat. He went worse than that. Worse than that. He employed the concept in his mobilization. He benefited from it. That's worse than using the term. So I wasn't defending Jagan. In fact, I was exposing Jagan. Yet. Anyhow, I love my brothers who went off on that tangent. But you know, that's where we are. So I went back to Mr. Hoyt to see what lessons we can learn from that period as we confront the present period. Because I happen to believe that we've come full circle. We have come right back to 1997. Remember, the Hoyt movement, slow fire, more fire, resulted from a disputed election in 1997. And Mr. Hoyt took to the streets with his supporters. It forced the PPP to come to the table. It forced CARICOM to act. CARICOM came in, they signed the Herdmanston Accord. The PPP, as usual, didn't hold their bargain, or it went back to the street. they went to St. Lucia and they sang another chord, the St. Lucia chord. Here we are in 2024, in the wake of the 2020 election, which also was a disputed election, and which also saw CARICOM intervening. But this time, CARICOM did not intervene to broker an agreement. CARICOM intervened on one side, on the PPP side. Let's draw the parallels here and see where we are going with this thing. Where we are going with this thing. After the 1997 election, Hoyt took to the streets. After the 1997 election, the PNC/coalition, APNU, did not take to the streets. Difference there again. Difference there again. So here we are in 2024. And when we look back at the Hoyt movement, Hoyt was able to bring the PPP to the table through massive street demonstrations. The present leader of the PNC was then the general secretary of the PNC, and he was the chief organizer of those demonstrations. Hoyt at some point pulled the people off the streets. And as I remember it, the present PNC leader did not necessarily agree with Hoyt for pulling the people off the streets. And as you heard in the interview there, I asked Mr. Hoyt, do you think it was a mistake? And he didn't think it was a mistake. When I look back as a political historian of sorts, I think in hindsight, it was a mistake to pull the people off the streets. Because you had the PPP on their knees at that time. You had them on their knees. And by pulling the people off the streets, you let them go. And the PPP, once you give them a little space, they will go against any agreement that is signed. But as Mr. Hoyt said, after a time, marching became an end in itself. It became an end in itself. And so when we look back at the 1997 movement, there are a couple of things. They were able to get the PPP to cut 2 years from its storm. They were able to get the PPP to cut 2 years from its storm. They were able to get constitutional reform. We may argue that the constitutional reform did not go far enough, but they were able to get that. Those are two concrete things that the Hoyt movement was able to deliver. It did not deliver what is called the knockout punch. I happen to believe that had Hoyt demanded power sharing at that point, that is half of the government, he would have gotten it. The PPP, in a sense, had thrown in the towel. And Hoyt pulled back. Because at that time, I don't think Mr. Hoyt was convinced that power sharing was the answer. By 2002, he had come to that conclusion that power sharing was the answer. But he arrived at that conclusion in August of 2002. He died in December. In my estimation, he arrived at that conclusion too late. Had he insisted on a power sharing arrangement, not sharing the PPP's power, but sharing with the PPP the power that he, Mr. Hoyt, represented, and that he represented over 200,000 voters. He represented half of the population. That is the power I'm talking about. When we talk about power sharing, sometimes people think you're sharing the PPP power. No. And Hoyt arrive at that conclusion a little bit too late. Here we are now in 2024. We had a disputed election in 2020. As I said, unlike Hoyt, the opposition didn't go to the streets. I think that was a mistake. I think the opposition in 2020 should have gone to the street and made demands, because clearly there was an impasse. Clearly, the elections were riddled and fiddled with. Clearly, the supporters of the opposition wanted to take action. The leadership did not feel that way, and so you didn't go to the streets. And so, in many regards, there is nothing tangible way that the opposition can show that it got out of the PPP in the last 4 years. Or it could show that he got them to give up 2 years, that he got them to go to constitutional reform. As I said, he could have knocked them out had he demanded power sharing, because they were ready. They were ready because they were on their knees. So here we are in 2024. And we are asking in 2024, what next? What next? You see, politics is not a Sunday school sport. And we have to understand what we are dealing with. Even as we are critical of the present leadership for not going on the road in 2020, we have to recognize that the conditions in 1997, 1998 were much different from the conditions in 2020 and beyond. In 1997, 1998, we were not a petrol state. Today, we are a petrol state. In 1997, 1998, the Americans were not as involved in our country, and the British and others were not as involved as they are today, as they were at the 2020 election. And so, therefore, even as we are critical of the present leadership for not being more militant, we have to recognize that the situation was vastly different, vastly different. In 1997, CARICOM came in and mediated. In 2020, CARICOM came in and took a side. Big difference. The Americans were not overtly involved in 1997, 1998. In 2020, they were overtly involved. They were overtly involved. Big difference. Big difference. And they were overtly involved in 2020 for reasons that we have discussed over and over again. And that is that Guyana has changed economically because of oil. And so, therefore, the big countries have an interest in Guyana that they didn't have in 1997, 1998. They have economic interest in Guyana. You're talking about the 10th largest oil find in the world. That's where we stand. That's a lot of oil, a lot of money. We didn't have that in 1998. And so the Americans and others are deeply involved because they have economic interests. And those economic interests then translate into political interests. Because the Americans want to protect their investments. They want a stable situation, quote unquote stable. They have Venezuela next door. And they want Guyana not to become like Venezuela. So the situation today is vastly different. Although when you listen to Mr. Hoyt, we are facing the same issues today, but we are facing them in different times. And sometimes we have to learn from history. One of the consequences of what happened after 2020 is that because the opposition has not won any big victory, opposition supporters tend to be very frustrated, very impatient, quite rightly so, because you are not winning anything big. No, it is not that the opposition has not won anything. They have won things, but nothing big like Hoy did. And so, therefore, supporters tend to be very frustrated. As I said, they tend to be impatient. They tend to be quite extreme in terms of their expectations of their leaders. And so, therefore, we have to study this situation very carefully. The PPP today is 10 times stronger than it was in 1997-98. In 1997-98, Hoyt was able to bring them to their knees because they did not have the kind of political space, the kind of political muscle that they have today. And the political space and political muscle that they have today has to do with the geopolitical environment that we are operating in. The PPP is enabled by the geopolitical situation. CARICOM took a side of the election and continues to take a side. Because CARICOM is interested in benefiting from Guyana's newfound wealth. And their policy towards Guyana, CARICOM policy towards Guyana, is driven by that imperative. And so, therefore, CARICOM is not playing the same role. And in any struggle of the nature that we are going through, you have to have allies. You have to have allies. And the PPP, because of the tremendous wealth that it has, it is able to buy allies. In many regards, CARICOM has been up for sale. And they're bought. They willingly submit themselves to be bought. And so we don't have as many allies in CARICOM, those of us on the opposition side. As I said, the Americans, the British and others, they're protecting their economic interests. And they're weighing the situation. And they are deciding what stance they will take that best suit them. And so there's no reliable ally among those big countries. In any struggle of this nature, you have to have allies. And so the opposition has the daunting task of trying to find allies to sway CARICOM, to sway the Americans and the British and the ABCE, to sway them on our side to see what is it we're arguing. There are forces internally that came down on one side. You see, if you start with the narrative that the 2020 election was rigged by the PNC, or attempt, as they say, there was an attempt to rig the election by the coalition. If you start there, then you're saying the coalition, they're scoundrels, they have baggage. And then you're saying the PPP, their hands are clean. So those who accepted that narrative that the coalition attempted to rig the election now find themselves in a bind because they're saying democracy is what drove them to accept that narrative. The logic then is that you have put in place a democratic government. It didn't take them 4 years to find out that what we have in Guyana is not a democratic government. Ask Kaitro News, ask Stabrook News. And both of those two newspapers accepted the narrative that one side attempted to rig and then the other side is innocent. So now they recognize that the government that they helped to put in place as a result of a disputed election has become a rogue government. They are in a tizzy of how to deal with that government because they start off from the position that that government is democratically elected. Now add the forces in Guyana, some of the civil society forces and the press and the media, had they accepted the narrative, as some of us did, that the 2020 elections were disputed and that what was needed was mediation. That is what CARICOM did in 1997-98, a disputed election, and they came in and they mediated. In 2020, CARICOM said that GCOM could not deliver a free and fair election, yet they signed off on the PPP government. Contradiction, but it was self-serving. And so, because we did not treat the 2020 election as a disputed election, we then accept the logic that the government in place was democratically elected. And the logic that follows from that is that it will govern democratically. The PPP has no incentive for governing democratically. No incentive. And in order for democracy to work, you have to have an incentive to make democracy work. The PPP has no incentive to make democracy work. There are no checks and balances. And so we are at this point. And sometimes what happens is that people turn on their own. You turn on your leaders. You know, the leaders not doing anything. They blah, 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 blah. People turn on their leaders. What I'm trying to argue here is that we have to be very clear-eyed, very, very clear-eyed about what we are facing. It is not impossible. I'm just saying we have to know what the situation is. We have to know what the situation is. And the situation is that the opposition has not a level playing field that it is operating on. Yesterday and today, the PPP appeared before the United Nations Human Rights Commission operating out of Geneva, and we're going to cover that tomorrow night. But they were forced to answer questions on corruption, on racial discrimination, on the crooked electoral architecture, which means that there is a recognition that all is not well in Guyana. There is a recognition that all is not well in Guyana. But what we don't have in Guyana is a unified anti-dictatorial movement. We don't have one. Some of our comrades are fighting the oil fight. And the oil fight means that you have to fight Exxon. So a lot of those people end up fighting Exxon rather than fighting the government. And so they're over there doing their thing. And then we have another set of people who are saying bad governance, bad governance, bad governance. The Stabroek News, for example, is fighting bad governance. Kaitro News is fighting oil. The problem, however, is this. They cannot call a spade a spade. As far as the oil is concerned, we have a bad contract. Exxon is taking advantage of the situation. But ultimately, it is the government of Guyana, that has to be held responsible. And the government of Guyana is siding with Exxon. Yet we are beating Exxon and not beating our own government. And that the monies that are coming are not distributed fairly. Our oil people are not dealing with that question of unequal distribution. They're not dealing with that. When it comes to discrimination, racial discrimination, you know, we tiptoe around it. I saw a wonderful editorial by Stabroek News. But what did Stabroek News say in that editorial? There are charges of discrimination, but these have not been documented. The logic there is that you can't charge a government legitimately with discrimination unless you can document it. So you can beat me up, and unless I can document that you beat me at 6 o'clock, you beat me with a rope at 7 o'clock, you knocked me with a bottle at 8 o'clock, unless I can document that, you're not going to accept that I get beat up. That is what these people are telling us. In order for us to arrive at a conclusion that the government is discriminating ethnically and racially, it has to be documented. That is what the Stabroek News is telling us. Let me remind our audience. In the United States, you had segregation. Segregation became legal in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, and it ended in 1954 legally with Brown versus Board of Education. And the Supreme Court, which handed down the Brown verdict, the Supreme Court did not ask for documentation. The Supreme Court started from the assumption that racism and racial discrimination are part of the system and the institutions. So they did not put the burden on African Americans. They did not put the burden on the civil rights movement to document and to prove discrimination. The Supreme Court started off by accepting that discrimination, racial discrimination, was inherent in the systems and the institutions. What civil society in Guyana and even some opposition politicians, what they are not doing is that they are not doing as the Supreme Court in the United States did. And that is to point out that the discrimination is inherent in the systems and the institutions in Guyana. And so therefore they're asking for evidence. Give me the evidence, give me the document. And when you document the thing and you give them, they then turn them out and say something else. Discrimination, racial discrimination, has always been part of the political and economic process in Guyana. Slavery, indentureship, colonialism. Before that, the genocide against Native Indians. All of those were racially discriminatory systems. And we have inherited that. We have inherited that racially discriminating system. African Guyanese are public servants for the most part. Indian Guyanese are sugar workers and agricultural workers for the most part. It is not because they chose that. It is because the economic system placed them in those sectors of the economy. And so when there is discrimination against public servants, as the PPP is doing right now, it's discrimination against African Guyanese. But that discrimination is grounded in the institutions and the systems, because the institution of government is manned and peopled by people of African descent, not because they chose to go there. It's because the evolution of our political economy placed them there. And so therefore, when you're dealing with discrimination against public servants, you have to deal with it from an institutional standpoint. But you're asking public servants to prove that they're discriminated against. What more proof do you want? When the government does not meet with their unions, when the government unilaterally gives them 6.5%, what more documentation do you want? And when you compare what public servants get with what other workers get that are located in other sections of the economy, you see the discrimination. You see the discrimination. And so we are in a moment where ethnic discrimination is rampant. And it is allowed to get more rampant because as a country, we have not dealt honestly with the ethnic question. We have not dealt honestly with it. And we continue to say to Black people, where is the evidence? Where is the documentation? You know, it's like you have an institution of slavery and you're asking the slave to document that he's being or she is being treated as chattel. So the situation today in our country is at a point that it has never been before. What has happened since 2020 is that all the contradictions, all the maladies, all the dysfunction of our society are now compressed. And we're dealing with them today. And some people want to say, well, no, it's class. Well, class is always there. Social class is always there. There are always poor people and there are always rich people. And so the question of class discrimination is also inherent in the system. But the racial discrimination is what is being utilized by the government to engage the society. And we are unwilling to confront it. We are unwilling to confront it. And so therefore the government gets away. I think we are at the point of 1997, 1998 all over again. All over again. All over again. The teachers just went on strike. The court ordered a mediation. The teachers complied. They acted in good faith. The government acted in bad faith. And here is where we are. Some people are saying, well, you know, the teachers should have remained on the road. And those things are easy to say. It's easy to say that. Perhaps the teachers might have gotten more or gotten a better deal if they had remained on the road. I don't know. What I do know is that what the teachers have done is that they've given the naysayers all the documentation that they ever wanted. All the documentation they ever wanted. We have to answer the question, therefore, where do we go from here? Elections are in the air. Elections are in the air. And we are saying, vote them out. Vote the PPP out. That is easy to say. But our electoral machinery itself is compromised. Our electoral machinery itself is a victim of where we have been since 2020. I saw Clement Roy respond to Vincent Alexander and said if GCOM were to implement biometrics, it would be unconstitutional. But GCOM, Mr. Roy forgot, or chose to forget, GCOM ordered a recount. GCOM ordered a recount and then used the raw data from the recount to declare the PPP the victors. So if GCOM can do that, why GCOM can't order biometrics? That's the first thing. If GCOM could order a recount and declare a government based on the recount, GCOM can do anything. But let us say they're saying it's unconstitutional for GCOM to do that. Then the legislature, the National Assembly, has the power to pass laws. And if the PPP want biometrics and the opposition want biometrics, then they go to the parliament with a bipartisan bill to get biometrics. Settle the matter. The opposition says it's willing to do that. The PPP says no. Yet, the same PPP is telling people that the coalition are riggers. And people continue to repeat that nonsense. Rigging has evolved in Guyana. Rigging has evolved in Guyana. It hasn't gone away, it has evolved. And yesterday's riggers are today's victim of rigging. Yesterday's victim of rigging are today's riggers. It's as plain and simple as that. Note, they said the coalition attempted to rig the election. Let us accept their argument for argument's sake. You then ask the question, why did the coalition attempt to rig the election? If you're saying they attempted to rig the election, why? Why did they? Oh, well, they saw they were losing. How can they see they were losing? How could they see they were losing? But they saw something. What is it they saw? When the boxes were opened, we saw what they probably saw. Yesterday's victims of rigging are today's riggers. Yesterday's riggers are today's victims of rigging. If we take, just let me take it at face value. The coalition attempted to rig. Or the 60, the recount, showed that the other side actually rigged. But if you jump off in 2020 by accepting the attempted rigging narrative, you now find yourself in a situation where you cannot say anything about what happened after this accusation of attempted rigging. The recount never happened, as far as they're concerned. People who voted while not in the country never happened. They have to silence that. And the PPP is sitting back and laughing because he said, look at those fools. We get them to go along with me and to say the other side was rigging, and they give me the government. And now they're trying to tell me that we're not governing right. And Jack Joe goes there every Thursday and pushes finger in their eyes. Many of the people Jack Joe cussing now, I'm not talking about the PNC and opposition people. Many of the people he cussing now are people who have to put him in government on that false notion that the PPP had won the election because the coalition attempted to rig. And so we don't have an opposition movement. And our history has shown us that when we're up against a government of this nature, you only overcome it with a broad movement. Broad movement. We don't have a broad movement. There are some people who still hate the PNC. And so, because they hate the PNC, they can't recognize that the PNC is today not the riggers. They can't allow their hatred of the PNC to get out of the way so that they can see the truth. And that is why I do not encourage hatred on this program. Because hatred has a life of its own. And it can blind you to seeing the truth. A lot of people of good standing, well-meaning, they cannot overcome their hatred of the PNC. And that is a very big factor. So, essentially what we are saying is that rigging has a biological life, and that is PNC. PNC have rigging in their DNA. And when you stretch that to its logical conclusion, it means there's something about Black people that makes them rig. PPP, therefore, are not riggers, because remember, you're either one or the other. So if one is a rigger, the other one can be a rigger. The other one is a victim. And so the other one is allowed to rig because rigging is not in their DNA. As my friend Rafi Dev said on a program the other day, oh, yeah, the PPP will try a thing. You know, he don't call it, he ain't calling it rigging. He said, they'll try a thing. They'll try a thing. But when it comes to the PNC, it's rigging. But with the PPP, try a thing. Every party try a thing. And that makes it very difficult to mount an all-opposition movement against the PPP. But we have never won big things without movements. And the biggest challenge for us now is to win a clean voters' machinery. That's the biggest challenge. That's the biggest challenge before us. How are we going to get a clean voters' machinery? Clean voters list, mechanisms in place to ensure that there's no voter impersonation, among other things. GCOM to ensure that it can deliver elections. So we need a structure and a model for GCOM that can make it as impartial as it can be. Those are three of the primary challenges we have. So, are we going to fight to win those things? Or are we going to go to a next election with the same arrangements. We saw what happened at the local government election. The opposition had to contest those elections with a crooked system for pragmatic reasons. Because had they not contested, the PPP would have been in charge of all the local government organs. And so therefore we have the dilemma of fighting for a clean electoral machinery, but also participating in the election to ensure that we don't legitimize a one-party state. It's a hell of a dilemma. Hell of a dilemma. If you go to the election without a clean machinery, you are implicitly validating a messed up electoral system. Because once you go to the elections, you're implicitly accepting the rules. If you don't go to the elections, then one party wins everything and you are legitimizing the one-party state. That is where we are, comrades. That is where we are, brothers and sisters. That is where we are as far as elections are concerned. If we do not clean up the machinery and we go to an election with the bad machinery, we are implicitly accepting the bad machinery, which makes complaint afterwards. If you lose, it makes your complaint ring hollow. If you stay out of the election because the machinery is bad, the other side wins everything and you are left out of the formal system totally. That's where we are. And I think as leaders, we have to let you all know the truth. Don't dance around it. And that's what I'm trying to say here. Hoyt was able to pull off what he pulled off in 1997, 1998, because he didn't have to deal with what we are dealing with today. He didn't have a petrol state. He didn't have a CARICOM that has taken a side. He didn't have the Americans and the British and so on who have taken a side. So he had a little bit more wiggle room. We are up against these forces. And while we are making progress in terms of letting the international community know what is going on, we are making some progress. We still have some way to go. It is not impossible. The teachers have shown that it's not impossible. It's not impossible. Teachers have shown that. In the twinkling of an eye, the situation can change. But we have to be honest with you all. That's where we are. If we go to another election with a bad electoral machinery, we are implicitly accepting the bad machinery. And maybe you can win with the bad machinery. I always think that in 2020, if the coalition was able to get a 10% more turnout from its base, despite the rigging, it could have overcome. In fact, some will argue, based on what we saw in the recount, what we saw in those boxes, the coalition might have won the election. It's difficult to tell who won. What you know is that votes were contaminated. So I'm not saying it's impossible to win an election with a tainted machinery. You could win. You could win. But it's better to get an electoral machinery that is clean and that all sides accept. And if you decide to stay away from the election, you have to face the fact that you are leaving the government to the next side. And you're then left outside the formal process, which means that your fight will have to be carried out outside of that process. In Dominica, the opposition did not contest the last election. They've made a choice, and they're outside of the formal system. I do not know that Guyana could do that. Our society is too divided. In Dominica, the division is along party lines because most people there are Africans. So there's no ethnic division between opposition and government. In Guyana, the political division is along ethnic lines. And so if you have a government where the PPP has all 65 seats in parliament, that has ethnic implications that I don't think the society is going to be able to withstand. And so therefore, that is where we are. I am putting it to you all. That is the dilemma. And we have to work out that dilemma. That's the dilemma. And I wish all the political leaders will put that dilemma before you all. And let us understand what we are dealing with. We don't have as many allies as we would have. We would like more CARICOM. I'm sure there's some CARICOM leaders who we can win over by letting them see and know what is going on in Guyana. But for now, the major leaders in CARICOM, the Barbados Prime Minister, the St. Vincent Prime Minister, and so on, they are going along with the status quo. So we don't have CARICOM as allies. I don't think that we have the British and the ABCE and the Americans. We don't have them fully as allies either. I think they have a better understanding of the situation than CARICOM. After all, it's the Americans who said the last election was disputed. But we've got to win allies. And then last but not least, because of the choice the leadership made immediately after the election, see, immediately after 97, 98 election, how it went on the road. After the 2020 election, our leadership did not go on the road. And the further you move away from the election, the more difficult it is to mobilize people to go on the road. And so therefore, that's a part of the dilemma. The teachers, however, have shown that it is possible to go on the road and to conduct a struggle on the road? In a militant way? In a militant way, the teachers have shown that it can be done. So it's not impossible. But I'm saying, as leaders, we have to be honest with you all and to let you all know the lay of the land. It is not impossible. In fact, it is very possible to overcome. It is very possible. Because when you are faced with challenges, then you script your tactics and your strategy to meet the challenges. But you first of all have to understand the challenges. And what I've been doing here tonight is to outline to you all what the challenges are. It is for us now to craft tactics and strategy to overcome those challenges. That is our challenge. It is not the challenges. Challenges there will always be. It is what tactics and strategies are we using to overcome the challenges. I think that's where the opposition is at this point. And I think as supporters of the opposition, that's where you all have to judge us. Do we have an understanding of the challenges we face? And if we have an understanding of the challenges we face, are we crafting the necessary and requisite tactics and strategy to overcome the challenges? I am arguing that no single party in the opposition can overcome those challenges on its own. It is why it was unfortunate that there was a big public meeting in Linden the other night, and the AFC was not on that platform to the best of my knowledge. The WPA was not there. I understand there was a lot of confusion. I spoke with the opposition leader who explained to me what the problems were. But I'm saying the optics weren't right. The optics weren't. As a start, we need an all-opposition movement. It doesn't mean that individual parties would not do their own thing. You have to walk on two legs. The individual parties do their things, but you have to have a movement. You have to have an all-opposition movement. And it doesn't only have to be the political parties, because there are other activists who are not part of political parties who are essential to the mobilization of these times. So as a start, I'm not saying an opposition movement is going to solve the problems. As a beginning, So there we are, sisters and brothers. There we are. I hope you've been able to clarify a few things, and I hope you've been able to put some things in perspective. Again, these are not meant to chase you all away or to tell you all the situations are impossible. No, it's not impossible. The teachers show that our situation is not impossible. What our situation does is that it challenges us to be creative, to be proactive. It is the test of political leadership. When you're faced with hard situations and you're able to come through, that is what tests political leadership. The coming months are going to be crucial. And each of us has to be a leader. We have to organize in our communities. We can't wait on the political parties. We have to organize in our communities. We have to organize at every level. We have to organize the base. We have to make outreaches to those in the base of the other party. We have to do all of that, not one or the other. And each outreach has to take into consideration the particular dynamics. So there are things that have to be done, and you all the supporters have to help us to do it. And I'm begging, don't get caught up in silliness, because they want us to engage in silliness and not to be very serious about what is before us. Thank you all very much for staying with me for another edition of Politics 101. Tomorrow night, we're going to be covering that meeting before the UN Human Rights Commission. Gail Teixeira appeared there yesterday, and they asked her about Sugate and all the other corruption. We're going to be covering that tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, we're going to be covering that. Because what that does is that they are being questioned and grilled on the international stage. You see, our journalists at home and our civil society, they go every Thursday to Jack Deo's press conference, and they listen to what Jack Deo says. And most of them don't challenge him. And those who challenge him, you just tell them plain, he ain't answering certain questions. And so we have to utilize all platforms in order to expose the PPP. In order to expose the PPP. Love you all, and as usual, thank you all very much for staying with us for yet another edition of Politics 101. And I'll see you all tomorrow night.